In school, we learned about the glorious ancient history of China that supposedly predates a lot the European history, but there are a lot of misconceptions about this history, like, for example, that it is based on some sort of old chronicles. Actually, the earliest written records of Chinese history date to the 17th and 18th century. And a widespread myth is that the dating of the so-called ancient kingdoms of China is established beyond the doubt based on so-called ancient astronomical observation allegedly recorded by the Chinese people, which is so far away from the truth. The most ancient Chinese horoscope of the grandson of the so-called Yellow Emperor actually belongs to year 1725, and all the information that I have used in this episode can be found in the links section below under number 21, and those who are interested in deeper study can find much more information if they read those articles and books. Other points also seem very confusing, like in the caves of China we see clear traces of high-tech equipment being used in the bygone times. But then the parts in the Chinese chronicle that do mention such high-tech equipment are declared to be fiction and legend, and basically are excluded from school history, which is strange because the artifacts confirm it. My confusion about the history of China grows further at scenes like this. Apparently they have very practical attitude towards the burial sites of their own emperors. You can see people growing lettuce around them. So let's try to make sense out of all this. China is home of many amazing grottos and man-made caves. All the grottos and caves that you saw so far are included in the official history of China. The historians find some place for them. If needed, they make a hypothesis and they present it as fact, but somehow they fit them somewhere. But when it comes to Huashan and Longyu caves, total silence. Mainstream historians strongly prefer that they are not mentioned at any cost at all. They classify them as mysterious or other more beautiful words like magical golden archaeological nuggets, Well, scientists were not believers in magic, right? So how come they say this is magical? What does it mean magical to them anyway? Well, the actual reason for which they don't want the public attention to be attracted to these caves are the marks that are left by the tools that made these caves. Now, these photos are from Estonia, from a sand quarry that is 100 years old. It looks pretty similar, yet not the same. The Estonian quarry has much more chaotic marks on its walls. Now, these are modern quarries. Do you notice the difference between the marks on the wall in the ancient Chinese caves and the modern quarries? Well, I myself cannot see any difference at all. On the right is ancient Chinese work, on the left is the modern work. Is there any need of commentary at all? Now, this is the famous unfinished obelisk in Aswan in Egypt. The marks on it bear much more resemblance with machine work rather than a work done with primitive tools. An interesting detail here is that the Aswan quarry is absolutely absent on the first drawings of the Egyptian historic sites done by the team of Napoleon, whereas the Aswan quarry now is just a hill on his sketches. So some suggest that this obelisk is a very modern and recent work. Well, great. However, Andrei Sklarov mentions this fact. I don't know if it is true. I've never seen him claim unsupported things, so he must be true. But if some of you is specialist, please correct me. He says, okay, it is recent, but what about this? We don't have such portable tools nowadays. All of our tools that leave such marks are huge and cannot be inserted in this narrow space. It will be nice to hear another opinion of a specialist. You have my email address. Please feel free to email me. Some people suggest that this looks like marks from some sort of burner that melts the stone to a very high temperature. But those burners, or I don't know what is it, kerosene lamps or something, I couldn't find images of it, they would explain marks like this, like scooping a small portion of stone after it's melted. The small burners that we have invented wouldn't have made this wall that is a few meters high. It is perfectly as if polished. Why would anybody invest a gigantic amount of work to just polish the sides of the quarry after they have taken away the stone? It makes no sense. It really looks like they have used some sort of gigantic tool that would scoop away meters of stone and leave a polished surface. If this is indeed a modern work, which could be, that means it has been done with technology that is not available for use to the general public. Which is absolutely possible. Soon I will make a video about the geoglyphs, and over there we will see that a lot of technology that the common people know nothing about, is being used today on Earth on large scales. Also, the hypothesis of these lamps or burners being used in Aswan in very recent time doesn't fit well with the holes. Some of them are so narrow that a human simply cannot fit inside to make them. Moreover, their walls bear no marks of any manual work whatsoever. And there is a large number of these holes out there in Aswan, and they are meters and meters deep. So how were they made if a human cannot even go inside to chisel them out? But let's get back to China. Actually, it's a huge complex of caves. We know only of two such locations, two complexes, some 200 kilometers away from each other. God knows how many are undiscovered, but even these two are so vast and are many, many kilometers long. Where is the stone that came out? If it was laying somewhere around there, shouldn't be any problem to spot it because it would be the size of a mountain. Indeed, the areas that are dug in this way inside are almost hollow inside, so it's just caves all through this area. It's like hollow earth almost. It is so vast. So was the dugout material taken away off-site, or did a great flood just spill it all over the world? The total of the length of the caves is many, many tens of miles, tens of kilometers. So, is there any high technology in the Chinese chronicles? Well, actually, yes, plenty, quite relevant to what we see in the caves. And even going much further, they had metal flying dragons that were transporting beings within the universe, not just Earth. There were metal servants that were doing the hard work. Well, I take it to mean robots. And their mass media was much more informative than others because they were well aware of the developments of the war between the parasites and humans. For example, they even recorded in their chronicles how at one point some of the non-earthly beings involved in this conflict, they closed the contacts between earthly people and their allies, the godly beings of the universe. Well, I must say, compared to the Chinese people in the past, we are in an informational eclipse phase nowadays, the modern people of Earth. The Chinese chronicles are absolutely clear on the point. Even their first emperor came from other planes of existence. He came from the skies. I'm not well familiar with the Chinese old chronicles and cannot confirm at this point was their first emperor on the side of the survivors or on the side of the parasites, or maybe even some third party, but those of you who are familiar with these old chronicles can figure it out easily by themselves. If he belonged to the party that cut off the connection between the humans and the celestial astral realm, he was on the dark side. And this is supposedly the burial pyramid of his son. Although both the father and the son did not exist according to modern scholars, still they assure us that they got buried, although they were never born. Wikipedia even says that this is the only pyramid in China, which is extremely strange given the fact that China is absolutely full of pyramids. We don't even know of what most of the Chinese pyramids are made because no research is conducted on them currently, or at least none is published for the public realm, but these are definitely stone ones. The blocks are rather big. Look at the size of the man over there, and they are in China as well, near the Korean border. Although China doesn't permit the study of its pyramids, at least acknowledges their existence in the recent years. And the very same is the situation with the Caucasian mummies in China. Not only DNA, but also the symbols on various artifacts found in their burials confirm that these tall Caucasian people were of the Aryan race, or what we call survivors. And it's worth to note that absolutely same situation is there in Egypt. Caucasian people belonging to the same race, same DNA, and buried with the same symbols of the same culture. And again, the knowledge about that is suppressed. The public is deprived of that knowledge. And we'll find the absolutely same situation also in Peru. Same people, same culture. Again, we have Caucasian mummies, and yet the general public is very little aware of it. But let's get back to the Shao pyramid. According to the official timeline, it is some 1000 years old. Well, I find that hard to believe just by looking at the photos. Look at its stones, they're almost as new as the modern paving around the pyramid. Mainstream history assures us that these burial chambers, if that's what they are at all, are more than 2000 years old. Well, some people raise the question, then how come the wood didn't rot or petrify? It's neither desert nor semi-desert over there, so it should have rotten by now, no? 2000 years, that's a lot. Also, Swiss watch discovered in 400-year-old Chinese tomb might be proof of time travel. Well, I'm not against time travel, but I see this more as evidence that, first of all, people were well connected at that time, and second of all, most likely this stone was built after the manufacturing of this watch, and since the watch has a proper serial number and it's well documented when it was manufactured, I think this is one way of dating this tome. And by the way, such a dating very well fits with the history line of the new chronology and doesn't agree at all with the mainstream history. After observing all these discrepancies between actual artifacts and history in the books, one starts wondering, how did this commonly accepted history of China appear anyway? Well, the first written historic chronicles of China date from the 17th century, when for the last time all old books were gathered by the ruling dynasty, burned, and a new history was composed because the old one didn't fit everybody's views. There is no need to search for alternative sources. In the chronicles themselves, it is said how they appeared. In the 17th and 18th century, there was a lot of activity going on in terms of establishing or creating the Chinese history, because the history of the previous dynasties was unacceptable for the current one, and that is why there was the need of creating private histories. That's how they express it. In year 1772, the government collected all printed books ever issued in China. This process of gathering the books continued 20 years. The committee that was evaluating what is to be kept from the old book consisted of 360 men. All books were categorized into four subcategories, and after a couple of years, 3,457 of them were printed again in a new form, and the rest of them, namely 6,766, were only catalogued, but some of them even under different names. And this complete rewriting and issuing of completely new books happened at least 3-4 times in the history of China. We don't know even how many, because there is no record to tell us. And each and every time there was a language reform which made it very difficult for the people to understand the old hieroglyphs. For example, nowadays people associate the swastika symbol with the Nazis. But even in the not so far away past, this was a symbol of good luck, light, love, and prosperity, and is still used as such in many cultures around the world. The hieroglyphic writing of China is one consisting of symbols, and as people were forced into language reforms, they not only lost part of their history, which could no longer be recovered from the old chronicles, even if they wished to, but most importantly, they were losing connection with the paradigm of the advanced old civilizations which laid the bedrock of their culture. So what is the aftermath of these language reforms and a writing of private histories? Anybody who has tried to read the chronicles that are available anonymously agrees that this is the most chaotic and unsystematic historical record that they can imagine. So these murky waters of the history of China gave scope to the modern history fabricators to run their imagination wild. And they did so without any pang of conscience whatsoever. And so we read about fairy tale kingdoms that existed thousands of years ago. And what is the dating based on? I would really like you to show you the basis of their dating. The basis are the well recorded, sophisticated astrological observations that were running in an uninterrupted line in China for thousands of years. Now, please pay very close attention because I'm gonna show you those continuous records of sophisticated observations. Here is the proof in its entirety. I'm really not joking, this is taken from this book, a very respected mainstream history book that is a product of international research. And here is how they explain it to us. These are not some parts of a clay pot vessel, these are astronomical records. And observations of sunspots are recorded on them. And because these pieces of clay pot must be, they say, must be at least 5,000 years old, that shows undoubtedly that the Chinese at that time had sophisticated observatories marking and studying and recording the sunspots activity. This is amazing. I'm gonna add it to my list of best jokes of mainstream history. And by the way, how did they conclude that these pieces are whatever 5 or 4,000 years old? Well, that's not even mentioned in their so-called research. That is just given as an axiomic fact of the existence that cannot be doubted for any reason. But this superb historic comedy doesn't end here. They continue. Well, this is not the only proof. There are other proofs of the sophisticated observatories of the ancient Chinese. And what is that? A Neolithic hill has been unearthed in Piang, that is the province of Henan in China. On both sides of the buried skeleton, 2 mosaics were found, made of seashells. One of them depicted tiger and the other one a dragon. Somebody expressed the opinion that these shells could be placed there, keeping in view the positions of the stars. And since this Neolithic burial should be some 5,000 years old, from this we can conclude that the astronomical observations of the Chinese have started at least 5,000 years before Christ. And I didn't make it concise. That was the full research, that was the full proof on which they base the dating of the dynasties that they found in the unsystematic chronicles. But I can tell you in short what is the rest of the book about, with one very good example. For example, there is somewhere in this chronicle a mention that the people gathered and watched how the stars are aligned in the sky. And that means that they watched the special alignment apparently that happens every 5 or 6,000 years, and it occurred exactly 5,000 years ago, and they watched exactly that. How did they guess it? There is no mention in where were the planets, in what alignment, in what degree. There is nothing. Basically, it says the people were watching the sky because there was something happening there. And on the basis of all this so-called scientific research, it has been established that these glorious Chinese kingdoms happened thousands of years ago. While in reality, we have almost no clue what was happening in China before 17th century even, what to speak of thousands of years ago. On one side, the Chinese historic records were corrupted by continuous language reforms and burning of old books. On the other hand, the general population was helped into forgetting the original advanced culture that they had some connection with by rewriting their hard disk with the help of opium. The British could not colonialize China, and that is why they had to find an alternative method to undermine their culture from inside by poisoning them. Not all drugs are poisonous and addictive, but the way opium was used in this case was absolutely negative. And although modern interpretations of the full development with the cunning introduction of opium in China by the British is always presented as some sort of economic operation for profit, please don't forget that it is the smaller players who are after money, those who only fulfill orders. Those who are on the top are not after money because they issue money, they create money, they can create as much money as they want for themselves, and they do it by simply printing more and more and giving them to friends who would do them favors in exchange. So those on the very top were not chasing monetary profit. Their aim was lowering the human consciousness, erasing the human memory, and rewriting the very definition of what human is. Because the original humans were being of goodness, being that naturally live in harmony with nature and the cosmos. Well, that full setup of happiness and harmony did not fit well with the new paradigm that was artificially imposed upon the humans. Well, even though it's very little, let's see what we know about the real history of China. First of all, we have the first wave of survivors, same as everywhere else. We saw it in Japan, in India, everywhere. And the proof of that are the Aryan mummies. Now, the next historical records that are genuine and proved indeed by actual astrological observations, indeed written in proper detail, and the dates that are recorded are from the time when proper history is available, and that is the Manchu or Qing dynasty. Now, it really seems that these Manchu people were the last wave of survivors. First of all, they were foreigners. Their language is alive till nowadays in some villages and has nothing to do with Chinese. Just have a look yourself. What were they building? This is not Europe. This is China. This is what these people built. The very same style that is the watermark of the survival culture. It is very mistaken to label this style as Greco-Roman because ancient Rome and Greece were just some of the parts, the provinces of the culture of the survivors. And not only the ornaments, also the technique used. We see standard bricks behind and the stone-like ornaments in front. I couldn't find pictures that would show that the so-called stone is cast as well here out of cement or geopolymer, but some other so-called ancient sites in China look very much like cement. This is listed as another ancient Chinese structure. Well, this is the summer palace in Peking. And by the way, there is linguistic evidence that originally the very name of the dynasty Manchu originated from Mogul, and those are the same Moguls that were the last wave of survivors in India, and currently they are on purpose confused with the Mongols. As we will see in one of the future episodes, Genghis Khan had nothing to do with Mongolia, and in the Chinese chronicles there is one more evidence out of the countless about the Mongols. These were very tall white people with blonde hairs and blue eyes. Doesn't sound like Mongolians to me at all. But mainstream historians, they mention, yes, it is written in the chronicles that Mongols, and they say the Mongols lived in China, and they very conveniently omit the description of those Mongols, or they call them Mongols. Well, even mainstream historians quote the chronicles. They tell us that the Manchus, although supporters of the Confucianism themselves belonged to another completely different religion because they were foreigners. And then they say something actually that is absolutely true. They say, well, they must have been shamans. Well, that's very true indeed. Another interesting detail that we find in the Chinese chronicles about the Manchus is that they claimed that they descend from a glorious dynasty that ruled the full earth. This claim would seem not only ridiculous but completely out of place if it was true what the Scaliger history is trying to convince us about the Manchu dynasty, that they belonged to some such an obscure tribe that nobody ever even recorded anything about them. But such a claim would be absolutely normal in the view of the history that I suggest, and the Manchus being part of the survival culture. And by the way, the Manchu dynasty ended up in China, again fleeing from Siberia, or at least some part of them. Some other records suggest that others came from nowadays Macedonian territories. It was a most likely international gathering of survivors. Part of them went to Japan and founded the samurai dynasties, and another division of these warriors settled in China. Initially, the worldwide survivor culture was forced to confine to political states or countries. That division did not exist during the thousands of years of peace, but it became a necessity when the parasitic influence started overwhelming the earth. So first the survivors were forced to confine with the worldwide empire. After that, this empire was broken into pieces. I'll cover it in detail after a few episodes. Eventually these pieces were all defeated, and the last one was in Siberia. But when this last organized center of relatively preserved ancient knowledge was defeated by the European military forces, the survivors found themselves more or less homeless. Of course, the majority of the population simply remained on the land that it was born on and was gradually devoured by the mass media of the parasitic culture. However, the military forces of the defeated army of the survivors desperately tried to save the last few pieces of the treasure, that is the ancient knowledge, and they fled to places like Japan and China. There are some vague mentions that at this point of time the ruler of the empire of the survivors was a young prince. His father was murdered, and who knows, it is entirely possible that his warriors, his army, brought him to relative security to a place like maybe China. But of course, this is just a hypothesis. I mean, the story about the young prince being taken to China, that is a hypothesis. The fact that the Manchu dynasty were part of the survival culture is so well supported that could be considered as history. Not only the Manchu dynasty was building in European style, but exactly at that time, Chinese style survivor culture became also very popular in Europe, and that is one good proof of well developed connections. In other words, they were maintaining relations with their brothers in Europe. Another interesting detail from the Chinese chronicles is that these Manchu people were foreigners, and they were of a very small number. They were trying desperately not to mix with the local population, but since they were so few, their assimilation within the local race became inevitable and was just a question of time. And here comes the interesting note. As the Manchus got assimilated, they lost their special abilities to fight. Maybe that's a hint that These people were still having somewhat special abilities inherited from the previous glorious race. Maybe they didn't lose them as fast as the people on the territories that were earlier captured by the parasitic paradigm. And my guess is that the martial arts of the East that use our internal psychic powers are somewhat a pale reflection of the original amazing abilities of the survivors. At this point, maybe some of you are wondering what happened to the numerous previous dynasties of China that, according to mainstream history, ruled for thousands of years. The truth is that from the available chronicles we cannot make out who was ruling when, were there any dynasties at all, and even some question where did those dynasties rule? Well, something it's obvious where the Chinese dynasties would rule over China, of course, but there is a hypothesis. I'm not saying that is confirmed history, but such a hypothesis exists, and it does have its valid reasons for existence. And the thing is that too many of the names and events in the so-called ancient Chinese history directly correspond to those of Europe. So it is entirely possible that when the Manchurian foreign rulers came, they brought with them history and wrote it down because that was their history. And subsequently, during the numerous revisions of the language and the history, as you remember, they were writing private histories because they didn't like the official one. So it's possible at the time of those revisions that they actually started interpreting the glorious history of their rulers that occurred on other geographical locations as their own. It is well known that there were Huns, like the Hungarian Huns. In China, there is even a scientific book, Huns in China, written by Gumilev. Also, according to the Chinese chronicles, there was a tribe in the region nowadays called Xianbi, but in the previous times that was pronounced Sarbi, Sirbi, Siri, like that. And in some languages till nowadays Serbs are Serbi in their own language as well. They call themselves Serbi, the Serbs. The Serbs in Europe, I mean. Also, according to the chronicles in the Chinese region in the north, there were Sveni, Shveni or Sveni. Well, till nowadays, the Swedish people, who by the way also live in the north, call themselves Svens, so that's another resemblance. Also, Chinese chronicles talk about Cheshi, who by the way were the neighbors of the Huns, same like in Europe, the Czech people are the neighbors of the Hungarian Huns. So what's the status of all these tribes according to mainstream history? Well, they have disappeared without any trace. Nobody knows anything about them. Well, except the Huns, the Hungarian Huns, where apparently mainstream historians say they must have divided into groups in very, very ancient times, and one group went to Europe and the other one went to China. Or maybe all these tribes did not disappear without any trace, but are well and living nowadays successfully in Europe. But it's not good to study history only from books. Let's go there on the spot. At last, I would like to present you an interesting blog that I found of a real person who decided to visit the town of Guanyi in China because the biggest burial complex is located there, and it supposedly belonged to an emperor called Zhen Zuan. These are a few old photos of this location. Well, it all looked very different nowadays. In the beginning, it was kind of okay, like these photos. But when he started walking around, he discovered that the Chinese can have a very practical attitude towards history. Apparently, even the very shrine of the emperor, or maybe this belongs to the queen or some nobility, something like that, but it is a supposedly ancient shrine, even that can have very practical applications. Also, his very journey to the town of Gian is very informative as of the current culture in China. To reach the town, he took a local bus for a journey some 40 kilometers long, and he was hoping he'll be there in an hour or so. However, it took him a full day. How is that possible? Well, due to the innovative marketing strategies of the person who is responsible for selling the tickets on the bus. So this lady made the bus stop at every corner, and she would get down and try to convince the bypassers that they have to go to Gian today. Well, people were trying to refuse because obviously they must have had some other agenda in their mind. That's why they went on the street going somewhere else. But she would not take no for an answer. She would actually try to drag them to the bus. Well, the innocent women were screaming, but some of the stronger men even tried to defend themselves. Well, this is China today. I really hope they will do something for their motherland in the very near future. Otherwise, all the glorious Chinese kingdoms that lasted for 6,000 years may cease to exist due to suffocation under a thick layer of plastic bags. Well, I hope I haven't disappointed you by basically trying to prove that we know very, very little about the real history of China. But please don't get disappointed. Maybe that should inspire you for you to help finding out what was the real history in China, develop your own astral vision, learn remote viewing that is absolutely realistic nowadays. No special abilities are required for those who learn. On this painting, we see a survivor doing a remote viewing of history. Don't forget that we are the descendants of that glorious race. And we are smart. Deep inside, we feel that the history presented to us by the mainstream science is not really the truth, and that's why we intuitively depict our real history in the video games. It seems that some fantasy video games are much more closer to the truth of what really happened in the past of our planet.